Hello from the Centre for Geopolitics in Cambridge. Thank you for joining us for our latest webinar, How Much Do We Care? The first part of a two-part event on the future of NGOs in a world preoccupied by the COVID crisis and its aftermath. Today, we look at the role of the NGO sector in delivering humanitarian and development aid across the world. Tomorrow, a second panel will explore the role of NGOs in fulfilling the promise and responsibility to protect vulnerable populations. It's a truly global subject, of course, and our discussion today couldn't be more topical, coming just hours after the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, announced his intention to merge the country's overseas aid department with the Foreign Office to ensure more coordination between development goals and British national interests. We'll come back to that later. But for those of you who don't know me, I'm Bridget Kendall, former BBC diplomatic correspondent and now Master of Peterhouse, one of Cambridge's colleges, the oldest and the smallest college, actually. I'll be your chair for this event. And we're joined by a terrific panel. David Miliband joins us from New York, President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee and a former British Foreign Secretary. Dr. Narmeen Hamid joins us from Lahore in Pakistan. She's chair of the Transitional Board of Directors of the non-profit Amplify Change. James Cohen is the UK-based CEO of the Halo Trust, the world's largest mine-clearing NGO. And Sara Pantuliano is Chief Executive of the Overseas Development Institute. So welcome to all the panelists. I'll kick off with some questions to them to get us going, but we're also keen to have your questions from the audience. Your microphones and cameras are switched off, but you can send your questions in through the Q&A option on the screen. Do give your name and affiliation and where you're from, and do indicate if your question is for a particular panelist. And to add, just as well as live streaming this, we will be recording it and we'll put up a link on the website of the Centre for Geopolitics later. So let's get going. And to set the scene, maybe I can start with you, Sara. Exactly how big the problem is of humanitarian aid, the need for humanitarian assist. Figures often suggest that it's just multiplying all the time. Is that the case? In which so, by how much and why?
Thanks, Bridget. Nice to join such an interesting panel. I mean, we hear, from the projections from UN appeals and others that needs go up all the time. I think it's important to distinguish how these needs are usually assessed and calculated. Sometimes they reflect also the cost of delivering aid and the cost, for organizations to deliver that. But it is, incontrovertible that particularly in the context of this pandemic and as a result of a lot of other pressures, the needs on the ground in a lot of countries are very high. And I think importantly, they're going to get a lot worse over time, because I think if we just look at the lessons from Ebola, a lot of the, the deeper repercussions from that crisis was felt, 2 years further down the line with the big food security crisis that actually affected a lot more people that, the pandemic, the epidemic itself had affected. So 12,000 people died as a result of Ebola, but 2 million people became vulnerable to food security. And I think that is what we need to bear in mind. We're going to be seeing these needs increasing over time for at least another couple of years, and not just in the poorest countries. We can, there is a lot of anxiety, in my institute about what is going to happen with middle-income countries, where the GDP downgrade is going to be very fast and very deep. Those are particularly connected to global supply chains, where tourism, is an important resource, where remittances are an important resource. We will see a new category of poor and vulnerability that is going to be, very significant, and plus in a number of contexts, this will aggravate instability, political instability and potential conflict that we already see. So yes, the needs are deep now and they only become deeper further down the line.
So David, Sara's addressing the impact of COVID. Against the backdrop of that, your organization thinks about refugees and was looking at an escalating problem pre-COVID, right? Can you paint a picture for us about what the burden is and why it is growing, why you think so?
Thanks, Bridget. Let me give a slightly, to build on what Sara has said. First of all, the International Rescue Committee is a global humanitarian charity that works across the arc of crisis. So we work in war zones like Syria, or conflict zones in Afghanistan. We work for the internally displaced who are forced from their homes. We work for refugees and we work for those who are asylum seeking and trying to integrate into new societies and assert their rights. So that's why we say we work across the arc of crisis. I think there are two really important things that guide me and that I hope can inform this discussion. The first is, rather than talking about the amount of need, talk about the gap between the amount of need and the amount of provision, because that's the key indicator. What we're living through at the moment is not just a record number of refugees, which will be confirmed later this week by the UN, not just a record number of internally displaced, but a growing gap between the needs of populations in humanitarian distress and the way in which the global system is responding to them. That's especially the case for women and girls, who are doubly, triply disadvantaged by inequalities of power and inequalities of justice, really, in humanitarian emergencies around the world. So the first thing I would plead with your audience is think about the gap between what's needed and what's being done. That includes the sense of the mindset, because the old model of humanitarian help was keep people alive until they can go home. It'll be a short-term thing. You keep them in the camp and then they go home and it's all over. The modern reality is that people are displaced by conflict for 20 or 30 years. They're not going home, and just keeping them alive isn't enough. You've got to help them thrive, not just survive. So that's the first point. The second point, which I think is really important to get a grip on, is that the new geography of poverty around the world is defined by conflict. The reason that there is a growing number of people in extreme poverty is not because of the Indias or the Chinas of this world. It's because of the Nigerias of this world. There are more extreme poor in Nigeria today than there are in China. I don't want to speak for Pakistan. Narmeen will speak very well about that. But parts of Pakistan as well have been plagued by conflict over the last years. Not conflict with India, but conflict internally and conflict with its neighbor in Afghanistan. And today, about 45% of the world's extreme poor, that's people living on less than $1.25 a day, are living in fragile and conflict states. And we'll come to the DFID point later, but one really interesting aspect of this is that historically, over the last 5 or 10 years, the UK has earmarked half of its aid spending for fragile and conflict states. So do some other countries, not the US, unfortunately. That fragile and conflict states are the people who need more aid, more quickly, more effectively, in a more sustained and innovative way. And so I think those are the two things to keep in mind in the analytical frame for this conversation.
So are you saying, David, that there's a growing problem of conflict, which is long, extended conflict, so therefore the number of people in need is greater and those in poverty, and then add on to that COVID as an extra thing?
Totally. I mean, look, I don't want to take up the whole time, but you're the center of geopolitics, or you're sort of headquartering this discussion for the center of geopolitics. There is a crisis of diplomacy today. The most likely outcome of a civil war is another civil war. The number of civil wars is many times greater than during the Cold War. The number of people fleeing internal violence is many times greater. What I call the age of impunity in civil wars that are going on around the world, which is widespread abuse of international humanitarian law without any sense amongst those committing those crimes that they're going to be held accountable for them. That crisis of diplomacy is the ultimate root cause of this, and you can get into why that's happening. Now, COVID is layered on top of that. And just to get my cards on the table, we see this as a double emergency. It's a health emergency for obvious reasons, that the population has underlying weak health conditions, and the health infrastructure in many of the places that we work is abysmal, either because it's been bombed, as in the case of Northwest Syria, where 85 health facilities, including ours, so I'm sorry to be passionate about it, but when your own ambulances get bombed by a host government and their allies, you get pretty worked up about it. Or there just never was much of a health infrastructure there, which is South Sudan or even Yemen. But there's also a social and economic emergency as well. And that's the collateral damage of COVID. And so this is a time when internationally governments should be stepping up, but in truth, they're stepping back. And we can get into why that is, but I can tell you from the front line responders to this COVID crisis are not being funded. Only $37 million of the $2 billion UN appeal that was launched in March has gone to frontline aid workers represented by NGOs. So we're actually reliant on private philanthropy, not on mass governmental support. And it's a reversal of what is the norm and is a massive problem.
Thank you, David. Lots of points there. We'll come back to some of them. Can I, at this point, bring you in, Narmeen, for your view on the ground in Pakistan, in the light of what David is saying? Does that chime with your perspective?
Absolutely, I quite agree. I think, the issue of conflict and increased need in that context is obviously there, but I'd like to just add another dimension to it, and that is the conflict that has already always existed, existing inequalities within societies in the global south, even elsewhere, but more pronounced here, which COVID-19 has exacerbated. And just looking at girls' education or sexual and reproductive health rights and the structural gender inequalities. So those are, even peacetime issues, but they have now become, magnified because of COVID-19. And in Amplify Change, for instance, we've seen in our partner in Nigeria has reported a 200% increase in calls to a domestic abuse hotline. And, there is increase in the incidence of female genital mutilation, early marriages, stigma and discrimination against marginalized communities, the sexual minorities, religious minorities. So those are issues that were already existing, but have been exacerbated. And to just, and add another point to that is what we've seen in the UK and the US is the intersectionality, looking at how health outcomes are, you can't look at it in silos or compartmentalize them, but you have to look at the way race and ethnicity has played a part in the demography of mortality. So all of these issues I feel are where aid is needed, and increased SRHR and inequalities have to be addressed. All these other inequalities have to be addressed when we think about where aid needs to go.
James, what does it look like from your point of view? Because the Halo Trust is a slightly different NGO. Your main focus is mine action, mine clearing, isn't it? So how does the current situation look from your point of view?
I think, Bridget, it's a real dangerous in us all violently agreeing. So I want to try and just take a slightly longer perspective. I do passionately agree with what all of the other three speakers have said. So my longer view is this, that I think we're living through a sort of 3-decade phenomenon. And at the start of each of these decades, there's been a strategic event. The first was 9/11. The second was the financial crash of 2008. And the third is the COVID event. Now, I think the first decade ushered a decade of interventionism with all the controversies that surrounded it. And the last time I saw David, you probably don't remember, was in my operations room in Helmand as the commander there, and all that entailed. Then we come the decade of non-intervention, of holding back. And what I really hope we're going to see out of COVID is a positive, that we're going to come into this third decade and think about how we can refashion our approach to this. Because I run an organization that has been in Afghanistan actually back into a fourth decade. We've never left. That's just one of our countries. We're in 25 countries. Our policy is not to leave, not to have an exit strategy. We don't believe in exit strategy. We believe in committing ourselves to these countries and seeing them through each of these horrific events that take place. Because we have tried to localize ourselves by creating a very localized workforce. Of the 9,000 people I employ, only about 150 are European or American. And we want to carry on that. And what we're looking for as we enter into this very difficult new decade is a new approach that perhaps touches on some of the things that were announced today by the British government.
Thank you for that. I'm going to bring this back to you, Sarah, because 4 years ago, you were one of the authors of a new report looking at whether it was time for a radical rethink in the way to direct funding. That's 4 years ago. Share with us a bit of your thinking on this, because this also came down to some extent, this was about more localism, wasn't it, and less centralization.
Yeah, absolutely. We prepared a report to try and inform and shape the debate at the World Humanitarian Summit that was held 4 years ago. And the report was called Time to Let Go. And what we were trying to encourage the aid sector to do was really to let go of some of the power structures that are still holding the sector behind in terms of rethinking how we need to operate. Unfortunately, I don't think enough progress has been made since 2016. It's very slow. There has been a lot of big pronouncements, a lot of rhetoric around commitments to localization, to cash, to a lot of the deeper transformation that the sectors need to see. But a lot of it has been lost in technocratic discussions about how to make tiny incremental steps. Whereas what we really need is a kind of a shift in the mindset through which we operate in the sector, is really rethink structures that are at best 75 years old in the case of the multilateral system, or older with some of the international NGOs, and really look at how we reimagine a sector that really puts frontline respondents and local respondents at the forefront, including with the right support in funding, with a system and a sector is a lot more equal, where the leadership is shared more equally, where complementarity is really enhanced. One of the things that came out of the summit was a big commitment to make sure the aid, particularly humanitarian assistance, would be as international as necessary and as local as possible. And we've just released a report a few months ago that actually shows that it's exactly the contrary, that we still see humanitarian assistance be as international as possible and as local as necessary, all in those places where the internationals cannot operate. It's really urgent, to commit ourselves, and maybe COVID can be finally the moment where we shift, the system. But we haven't seen that. It could have been the moment for donors to really put more money in the hands of local respondents. It doesn't happen. So it will be incumbent on all of us to champion and make sure the change really does happen.
What do you think about that, David? There you are, you're in New York, you're in charge of a very large organization, the International Rescue Committee, which covers an enormous number of countries. So how do you coordinate internationalism so that you pool resources and to that extent make that more effective with localism that means it doesn't get caught up with being too centralized and too bureaucratic?
Well, Sarah and I have had this discussion for a long time. I think we agree that a framework that says international bad, local good is not going to get us anywhere. I mean, what we need is the best of international expertise, which can come from the countries that we work in as well, with local roots. And that's what we try to live out in the way we structure the work of the International Rescue Committee. So 95% of our staff are local staff. Inside Syria, we've got 800 staff. They're all Syrians for obvious reasons. But the local roots that they offer are supplemented, are complemented, are supported by a global infrastructure of technical expertise so that we can use our experience from around the world to make sure that we're arming our frontline aid workers with the right kind of tools to do their work. We can give them the financial and other compliance support structures that would otherwise overwhelm local NGOs, because all sorts of taxpayers and private donors want to have all sorts of compliance conditions met. And I think there's a third part where we've got to do a much better job, and Sarah has done a really good job in highlighting the importance of this, which is that in addition to us being good at hiring and promoting, by the way, our local staff, where we've got to do better, but we're on a journey there. We've also got to structure relationships with civil society organizations in the places where we work. And this is directly relevant, not to some kind of happy aspiration to just be diverse. It's about real quality of engagement and impact. And we know from our work on Ebola, for example, which is directly relevant to the current COVID crisis and is directly relevant to Sarah's point, the most precious asset in a health emergency is not a hospital. The most precious asset in a health emergency is trust amongst the local population. Because if they don't trust the information they're being given, they're not going to go to the hospital. And in too many of the responses to Ebola, trust had broken down. That's why you didn't get a real beating back of the disease until there was real community engagement. Our approach to the COVID crisis has been to really try and understand that, not least because 5 years on from the West Africa Ebola outbreak, fake news, misinformation is a massive problem at the front line in taking on and preventing and treating COVID. So I would say we've got to think not about international good, international bad, local good, but about genuine international expertise plus deep local roots. Where I think we've got to really call out and sound the alarm is Sarah's point about regression since the 2016 summit, not just on a sensible version of local engagement. Multi-year funding has gone nowhere. Transparency, not going anywhere. Not because of the NGOs, I have to say, and because we are required to be transparent. So I think there's real work to do, and I'm afraid the system won't change, or the sector won't change. It's more of a sector than a system. It won't change until the donors change, and they are fragmented and short-term and risk-averse in the work they do. Although, of course, we love them because, and we depend on them because they fund us. But the truth is that we've got to get our donor community to recognize that they need to take impact and outcomes far more serious than they do. And that will drive them, and cost efficiency actually, that will drive them to much more coherent, longer term ways of addressing these humanitarian crises, which, where James is right, they're not short-term crises. They're not just keep people alive for 6 months and then you leave. We've been in Afghanistan since 1976, and these conflicts go on, and so the people need us. And they need us as locally rooted NGOs with a global support structure.
So you're talking about donor fatigue in a way, yeah? People
No, that's too easy. No, I mean, there may be donor fatigue, but there's donor disunity, fragmentation, not invented here syndrome.
No, Namin, your thoughts on this now?
Well, first of all, I think I agree that, you know, this distinction between local and international is not helpful at all. I think we need to talk about common goals and shared values. I think that is more useful. But I will share the experience of Amplified Change as an organization that has provided proof of concept of how a local model of funding can work. Because we've got over 1,000 CSOs, small organizations, grassroots level, in over 85 countries in sub-Saharan Africa and across in South Asia. And we've been able to have we've been able to show with evidence that we have, influenced policy decisions almost, if I were to quantify it, 34 significant policy changes in 24 countries. And this has happened because there is ownership, because as David said, it's local expertise with international support. But the effort has been local, the ownership has been local. And an important point I feel that one needs to make here is the relationship between what we, and the terms are problematic between donors and recipients, but that dynamic and the framework within which we look at donors and recipients needs to change, because it has to be, right now it's a skewed relationship. It's a very unequal dynamic. And what it needs to be is more equal, more respectful. When you go local, you're showing that you respect the local wisdom, and that the projects, as an Amplified Change we've seen, the projects are driven by what the local communities need, and not by perverse incentives imposed by donors. And by working together, learning together, building movements, building networks, building capacities at the local level, ensuring that in the long term what we want is for them to be independent, is the way to go, I feel. And that's the model we need to work towards.
Let's come back to this thought about perverse incentives. Sarah, this occurs in your report, doesn't it? The idea that big organizations, multilateral organizations, the United Nations perhaps, others, need to think not just in terms of they're successful if they're big, but they need to think about other ways of measuring success. Explain your thinking, but also perhaps you can explain why this is so difficult to get traction with.
Yeah, and in a way, it echoes what both Narmeen and David was saying. Success is the collective outcomes that we all shape. It's not international good, local bad, but it is, really being realistic and honest about our complementarities, where we add value, what we can bring, particularly as internationals compared to the nationals, and not trying to hog the space or the money even more. If we're not necessarily as internationals the best place to perform that function. But the problem is exactly the incentives, because success to date in the multilateral system, but I would say also with international NGOs, and I put the think tanks in that space too, is measured in terms of your growth, the growth in your budget and the growth in the number of staff that you have. Is the metrics of other, if you want, companies and organizations that the sector has taken on. And until we redefine, these incentives into something that really looks and how we make progress collectively to, reduce poverty or reduce, humanitarian need or, sort of redress inequalities, that's where we can, change the way that the system operates. Otherwise, it will always be a competition for resources, a protection, turf war to protect mandate, an institutional inertia that unfortunately characterizes the sector, because everybody is trying to really argue, for a share of the market almost, because in some countries that's how it is considered. And some organizations are better than others, absolutely, but generally the sector is driven by incentives that are not, in the best interest of the people who are affected by crisis always.
Well, of course, important donors are individual countries. And that brings us on to the subject which has been in the news today, the statement in Parliament just a few hours ago from the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, that he's going to merge the British Overseas Aid and Development Department with the Foreign Office. So they will both come under the Foreign Secretary, who will decide, he said, where aid will be targeted and where it will cease to be targeted, and then come under the National Security Council, which he as Prime Minister chairs. So there's a big announcement today, although it's been something which has been discussed quite a lot in the run-up to this. James, you're in London with the Halo Trust. Well, you're in Salisbury actually, but you're in the UK.
Yeah.
So tell us, what's your reaction to this announcement today? We've already had a question on that actually from Catherine Weston, who's Director of Brand and Comms at SOS Children's Villages UK, wanting to know what the panel
So I spent the bulk of my career, 32 years, as a soldier. And so I'm quite a newcomer to the aid sector. And what I find remarkable is, for something that is purportedly very progressive, it has quite a conservative approach to life. And I think it will have a lot of difficulty with this. I'm personally not in the least bit troubled. I think that the government could be onto something. I think half the problem with a country like Yemen is the lack of an integrated approach. The fact is that the airport doesn't work properly, that people can't get in, we can't do our work there effectively, we can't scale up in the way we need to. And that requires an integrated approach between not only our diplomatic and development capabilities, but our defense capabilities as well. Now, that is a form of anathema. I'm the sort of antichrist speaking words of that kind, because it's very siloed, very tribalized, and it needs to be broken down. So I congratulate the government for doing this. But there's a devil in the detail, and we've got to make sure that it is done well, because it's easy to announce something, but not so easy to deliver on it, particularly in the middle of a crisis. So I applaud it, but I want to see it done as well as it should be.
You don't want to be too binary here, of course, but it is quite paradoxical to hear you say that when we've just been talking about the need to break down two large international aid conglomerates, because it's only when you get to being local that you're in touch with what's going on the ground. In a way, your argument in support of what Boris Johnson has done is that big is beautiful here. But I realise that's a simplification. Let's get some other reactions. David Miliband.
So in an earlier life, I wrote the 1997 Labour Manifesto, which pledged to create DFID. And the idea that DFID has been around for a long time, I'm afraid, is not right. It was an innovation, and it's...
Oh, David is frozen. Just at the point where we were hearing about his 1997 manifesto. I'm sure he'll be back in a minute. It's not quite there. Sarah, give us your reaction.
Yes, I mean, I'm sure David was going to tell us, how...
Oh, David's back. David, sorry, are you there? David? It's a slightly dodgy connection from New York. Sarah, go ahead and we'll get David back.
I was saying that I actually, I was expecting David to say how proud he was of having created DFID. And DFID has been a fantastic force for good when it was at the height of leading, some real innovation in terms of policy, in terms of thought leadership. Has been a fantastic asset for the global development community, not just for the UK. But to be honest, we, over the past 4 years, with 5 changes of Secretary of State, with, not the politics not really supporting the department the way it has been in the past, it's been a very different experience. I think the sector has been far too fixated on the structure and the value of, an independent DFID versus, a merged DFID. I'm less worried about the structure, I'm much more concerned about the objectives of the merger and how it will be realized, to James's point, because a merged department in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. On the contrary, it could improve the strategic aims of if you want, supporting unequal climate policies, trade policies, all sorts of approaches to inequality that need, the full force of government. Principled foreign policy and overseas, international development can, be mutually reinforcing. But I am concerned about, first the objectives and the way in which this has been announced today, and the extent to which development professionals, are fundamental to the success of DFID, will be included, represented, championed in this merger, in the new sort of Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. To me, today, sounding more as a takeover rather than a merger. Of course, the devil is going to be in the detail, but we need to monitor this because it's going to be fundamental that those, specific competences that strength that has been actually a great asset for global Britain, to the PM's point, is not lost in the merger. It doesn't become, diluted. To date, the assessment of international development spend by other departments other than DFID has not, been covered in glory. ICAI, that assesses the independent commission that assesses the quality of aid in the UK, has been very negative, has been very critical of how other departments have spent aid. Whereas, of course, we, DFID has made sure that was done in a principled and transparent and as effective as possible way. We need to make sure that we retain, this capacity in the new merged office. So yeah, we'll be monitoring how this merger goes, and of course, support, trying to make sure that it can be successful. But yeah, today I'm a bit concerned about that, how this has been announced and the objectives of the merger. Also, to be honest, another point is the timing. Right at the moment in which you are addressing a pandemic, where you need, the focus of a department like DFID to be entirely on, supporting some critical public health priority internationally, and all sorts of consequences that are coming out of COVID. Rearranging your bureaucratic furniture doesn't seem to be the most critical, crucial thing to do.
David, you're back.
I mentioned the defense of DFID and I was immediately kiboshed, so I don't know.
We just had time to hear that you invented DFID in 1997, so carry on.
Yeah, well, the point is that DFID has proved its worth. The world is full of problems, Britain is full of problems. Let's not try and fix the things that are not broken. And I've seen how on the ground, the Foreign Office can use its expertise alongside DFID and frankly alongside the Ministry of Defence too. James is right about Yemen, that it's the world's largest humanitarian catastrophe, but it's a political catastrophe. The crisis of diplomacy is the absolute heart of the Yemen crisis. And changing the balance between the Foreign Office and DFID is not going to solve the problem of Yemen, I'm afraid. And so
you say it's the other way around, though, that if it's a crisis of diplomacy, and if you're saying a lot of the problem with of these humanitarian crises is diplomatic, if you join them up and put it with the Foreign Office, maybe that would help.
No, because Britain is the pen holder at the UN on Yemen, and it's not the divorce or the separation of DFID from the Foreign Office that has prevented Britain from being a much more active player on the Yemen file. The truth is that if the Trump administration said to the Saudi-led coalition, we need to change our strategy for the Yemen today, it would change tomorrow. And it hasn't changed. And that's where the diplomatic effort is completely stalled at the moment, to the absolute horror of outsiders and to the threat to life and livelihood of the Yemeni people. And here's the danger, that Britain spends the next 6 months rearranging its institutional furniture when we're in the middle of the world's largest pandemic for 100 years, when British aid policy could be a genuine leader. Because whatever you say about DFID, it put Britain 10 years ago, 20 years ago, at the absolute forefront of reform and innovation to deliver value for money, to deliver real impact in the global system. That's been lost over the last 3 or 4 years with successive ministerial changes. Ministers have lasted 6 months. And that's a real problem at the moment. And I'm afraid the danger, my plea to Dominic Raab would be to make sure that we don't have 6-month hiatus as this is done. They've made the decision, okay, we got to live with it. It's going to happen. There's a whole room for analysis. But the key thing now is that if there's 6-month hiatus, people will literally pay with their lives. British aid money needs to be out there now, and British influence needs to be felt at the global level to get a sensible way of getting money to the front line in this COVID crisis.
I mean, I can see you're nodding a bit there. Let's hear your view from where you are in Pakistan. It's particularly interesting on this question of the COVID-19 crisis, because the logic, as it looks like from the UK, is that we're now rearranging some parts of government because we've moved to a different stage in this coronavirus crisis. But of course, globally, we don't know if that's where we are yet.
Absolutely not. I think the timing is the worst aspect of this merger, because from where I'm sitting and this part of the world, COVID-19 is, very much in the initial stages of its ravages, and we are expecting, the worst impact to be seen around the autumn, perhaps in the next 6 months, when all of this rearrangement is going to be happening, and the void is going to be felt very badly. But
just how bad does the crisis feel in Pakistan?
The crisis is getting worse by the day. We have not had, in the numbers that are being shared, for instance, now we have about 3,000 deaths, which looks very small in comparison to other countries. But I think one of the issues is that the reporting has not been honest. The best statistics that we are getting and the most reliable statistics are from the graveyards, because people are dying without getting tested and without getting to the hospital, because hospitals have no space anymore. So, but the graveyards are filling up. And so, that's an indication of where the crisis is heading. And obviously, the health infrastructure is overwhelmed. And the government has shown that it has different priorities. So that's where the crisis is. And so the void in any support that could have come in will be felt very badly. On the one hand, it really depends on how they execute this. And sitting from here, I'm not in a position to judge how the government will enact this. But it seems to me that, someone mentioned the issue of trust and trust between governments, and has been a big issue. And perhaps, if from one point of view, if the aid coming out of the UK, there is a more coherent and a more direct message, then there could be an allaying of suspicion and that mutual distrust between governments and the political doublespeak. Perhaps that could be reduced. But I think more likely there is going to be, politicization of aid, and a blurring of the distinction between humanitarian aid and political interests. And governments are going to vie and lobby for their mutual respective interests. And in this battle of elephants, I'm afraid it's the grass, the vulnerable, marginalized communities, the controversial human rights issues that are going to be trampled and overlooked. So yeah, so I have concerns about this.
We have a couple of questions on this. And here, I suppose Britain is very much in everyone's forefront because of today's announcement, but it could be written about other Western governments too. So Jack Cooch, University of Leeds, do the panelists think that the move to merge DFID into the Foreign Office, FCO, is genuinely about improved integration, or is it the beginning of a new narrative on the future of our international aid commitments? So the question there, James, maybe to you, is we have this commitment, which so far successive British governments have held to commit a certain portion of our budget to development aid, 0.7%. Is that going to hold, especially given all the pressures that we know there'll be on the economy as a result of this coronavirus crisis?
So I think that the 0.7 will survive. It's a question of how it's interpreted. I think the British Prime Minister is in fact an internationalist, and I think he's a fundamentally humane individual. And I don't think he wants to undermine that. I think the question is how that definition is put into action. Already, if you look at, last year, 15 billion spent on overseas aid, only 11 of it was spent by DFID, 4 billion by other government departments. So there's already quite a lot of reanalysis of how the money is spent. What I think is really interesting, and I think what the Prime Minister is really trying to drive at here, is that there is a subculture within DFID which is different from the rest of Whitehall. The sense that they are not crown servants, that they are not necessarily there to serve the national interest. And I do think he wishes to address that. And I think that it would be good, instead of just shoveling money out the door, back to David's early point, shoveling money out the door to the multinational institutions, but actually to see how the money is going to be spent, because there's going to be a lot less of it. 0.7 is going to look smaller under a revised GNI, and we need to find ways of spending it well. And organisations like the IRC spend money well, and I'd like to believe mine does too. But we get a tiny amount of what DFID spends, and a lot of it is spent within the vast bureaucracies of the multinational organisations. And I think that not enough attention is paid to the outcomes. How is it that our beneficiaries really, what is the livelihood improvement to the lives of our beneficiaries, rather than just the amount of money spent by DFID? And I'd like to see that culture addressed, and I do think our Prime Minister's onto something.
What do you think, Sarah? I mean, you could say, here's an opportunity for radical rethinks. What do you want?
Yeah, it is an opportunity for radical rethink. I'm just, as I was saying before, I'm not sure that the objectives and the values that underpin the merger will give us the radical rethink that we need. Of course, we want a system that works better, that is more efficient, that is, more accountable. But as I was saying before, everything we've seen from spend in other departments of HMG so far, when it comes to overseas aid, has been less good than how DFID has spent it. Let's see, if this development competencies that are protected in the merger and can really, sort of bring better, synergies between the diplomatic cadre and the development cadre, then yeah, potentially. But hearing the Prime Minister today say the overseas aid and foreign policy are one and the same, leaves me sort of a bit, gives me pause, because they're not. I mean, yes, they can be mutually reinforcing, but they're not the same. And of course, we've seen already attempts by these governments to change, to try within the context of the OECD, with DAC, to change some of the rules around what can be classified as aid. So it'd be interesting to see, how much of the merger will also focus on looking at how flexible interpretation of what can be spent as overseas aid is going to become. But as I said before, I have an open mind. The merger, we work with a lot of governments where these departments are merged, and we have fantastically principled aid from Scandinavian countries, from others. Is spent very well. But it is how the merger is done. What are the values that underpin it? What are the objectives? How the professionalism of the cadre that at the moment is at the heart of DFID is protected, championed, and brought at the heart of the Foreign Office, so that this is not a takeover, but a real sort of, merger of different competencies.
David, you led the Foreign Office for a while. The culture there, and we've been talking about how the culture at DFID has been different. A question from Helen Michelini, what is the role of humanitarian actors in serving the UK national interest?
Well, I don't think it's healthy to impugn the motives of people that one disagrees with. So I'm not going to speculate on the motives of the Prime Minister in this move. Equally, I hope James won't pursue his impugning of the motives of the DFID staff. I mean, I dealt with a lot of DFID staff in government. I was in the Foreign Office, obviously. Also, actually, when I was Environment Secretary, and I deal with them in this job. I mean, they have a very strong commitment to fulfilling the basic code of a civil servant, which is to carry forward the policies of their government. So I would urge us not to go down that route. The true problem for the Foreign Office is different. I think that Rory Stewart has actually written about this today. The true problem for the Foreign Office is it lost control of trade policy to a new trade ministry. It lost control of European policy to a new Brexit department after 2016. And the creation of a new intelligence infrastructure around the quote-unquote National Security Advisor in 10 Downing Street has also denuded the Foreign Office. One of the things that Rory Stewart points out in his article is that we spend half as much on our diplomatic corps as France does. And that's the real problem that the Foreign Office faces. But there's something bigger than this, and I think this gets to the heart of the question. In some ways, it gets to the heart of what James has said. It certainly gets to the heart of the person from the University of Leeds who asked this question. We're living at a time when there is a retreat by Western governments overall from global engagement. That is the big story of this last decade. And it's obviously led from the United States, where what Richard Haas, the head of the Council on Foreign Relations, called the withdrawal doctrine, is preeminent in the definition of what America first means. It's clearly not confined to the United States. There's been a reining in of foreign and overseas policy, notwithstanding the 0.7%. The EU has not become a global actor in the way that some of us hoped. And there's competition on the global stage. I mean, every African country that we work in, 23 African countries, there's other people moving in. I mean, China has a systematically active diplomatic development, they're not the same ministry, by the way, diplomatic development, commercial engagement. And that is a new geography of power around the world. And I think that that is the bigger picture here. And if Western publics are not going to be willing to engage to take on a proportionate share of the burdens of managing the global system, we're going to find that the blessings of the global system are reduced as well. We're going to become more unequal, more unstable, more insecure. And that is the actual heart of this, whether or not Western politicians and Western citizens can muster a degree of unity that allows international engagement. And I think that's the big picture that we face today.
David, everybody's expecting in this coronavirus epidemic, no one knows how the infection will develop, but there is an expectation that economically we're already looking at Britain in a slump. There is already talk of job losses. Isn't it going to be harder and harder for the government to argue that they should put aside money in the budget to help those overseas when people will be clamoring for money to help those who are in dire straits in the UK?
Well, I'd say two things about that. First, people are in dire straits, and you've seen that with the free school meals campaign that's been run by Marcus Rashford, the Man U footballer. But we've also learned that money can be found. I mean, this is a time of historically low interest rates. You've had, in the US, literally multi-trillion dollars thrown at the economic crisis. In Germany, of all countries, which has always ruled by what's called ordo-liberalism, which is a very austere approach to fiscal policy. You've got a massive 4% of German GDP, 4.5% of German GDP. Britain has thrown not so much, but significant amounts. So the first thing to say is this crisis has allowed for really renewal of thinking. Secondly, you're obviously right. There's an obvious argument that says, well, charity should not just begin at home, but end at home. But actually what the corona crisis shows is something completely different. It shows the opposite. While you have holes in the global safety net, while coronavirus is rampant in other parts of the world, there will be no full return to normality in Britain. In Pakistan, a country where we have a lot of staff and which has close links to Britain, if the crisis is not contained in Pakistan, it's not going to be contained in Europe or the UK. And so to think of this, there's this Israeli author called Yuval Harari. Many of you will have read his books, Homo Sapiens, amongst others. He talks about the dystopian vision of the future of a network of fortresses. That is what ultimately the argument against overseas aid is. It says, let's build up our fortress. And the truth is, it makes no sense in a world where you've got connections of people, you've got connections of climate, and that's an argument that has to be won. And I don't think we should be ashamed of saying it's not just about having a big heart that says you should have a proper aid program. It's actually common sense, because in the modern world, if you don't have effective international aid, you're weakening yourself.
So we've had a lot of questions about funding, and this whole area, obviously it's of huge interest to people. David has given an answer with regard to how we should respond to coronavirus and how you justify their international funds help you at home. From your own organisation, David, Oliver Phelan, who's here in the UK, but with the International Rescue Committee, he is interested in hearing how can we best argue for greater spending by government donors on humanitarian assistance, given the global recession we're entering into? Isn't it the reality we'll now have to focus on defending current spend or protecting vulnerable budgets like funding for gender-based violence, despite the fact that this spending is far from enough? So in other words, are we going to go on the back foot? No, I mean, maybe that's one for you, because Amplify Change is involved in exactly in this area, isn't it? That you're just going to have to defend the sort of level of budgets that you've got now instead of looking for more.
Look, I think it's really stating the obvious that what COVID-19 has shown us is that we live in a world where even if we were to operate on selfish interests, we have to think collectively, and we have to look after the most vulnerable, because unless we do, we're all going to end up in danger. So sure, we have to defend the budgets that we have, but I think that the struggle and the aspiration should be to look after those who are more vulnerable and from where who are at the most risk to get more resources. Because unless we think collectively, we are doomed as a whole world.
So Carolina Hazen, who's sent in a question, she chimes with that. How do humanitarian aid organizations factor in nature conservation, she asks? There seems to be some level of competition for funds, but in reality, people and biodiversity are interdependent. Exactly your point, Narmeen, that we need to think holistically about this. I had another question that I wanted to put to you, James. With the changes, this is from Dominic McVeigh. With the changes at DFID and a reduced GDP impacting budgets, what can we do to get the private sector to step up, and what role can they play? Furthermore, if DFID and others have less funds, what laws should we think about trying to drive forwards to make the private sector more responsible for any potential damage they're causing to planet and community that causes humanitarian crisis? So levers for the private sector. To you, James, and then, I don't know, maybe, Sarah, you've got a thought on that too.
So, I mean, like most charities, we derive a lot of our money from government, state donors, and we derive some of it from private donors. And I put a big effort in my 5 years in Halo into increasing the amount of private support we get. But what is really apparent to me is that one of the problems we have as a humanitarian organization is that, again, it's siloed. Where I've had success recently is in looking at climate change and looking at biodiversity. Now, those are two things that don't really sit very nicely with DFID, but yet I've got a project going on in Angola at the moment to remove landmines from the Okavango Delta, the headwaters. They're heavily mined. Mines breed poverty, and poverty breeds poaching and environmental degradation. Now, that's an example of how, if you can break down those silos and bring these things together, then you can begin to attract big private donors and make a huge difference. Now, I'd like to see more of that kind of thinking going on, and I'm afraid I don't think that happens sufficiently at the moment within the present structures.
Sarah, private sector.
Yes. So to me, it's actually going beyond just thinking about the private sector as donors. The private sector has huge competencies that they can bring to bear to address a lot of the things that we work on. I mean, David and I do a lot of work with the World Economic Forum and are actually in a council that's trying to do exactly that, looking at how we bring those competencies, especially when it comes to reducing the digital divide or, roll out technologies, to develop infrastructure that can allow, people to be better connected, to have more opportunities, ways to address that are more direct. And a lot of it is actually also related to how we deliver it. We did for the past 20 years a lot of work to try and really push a significant shift towards cash transfers, to making sure that we can put money directly in the hands of people so that they have choice and agency about how to use that money. But again, the competencies of the private sector to be able, to really maximize these social protection systems, to make them more agile, to use the technology to do that, is quite important. But that is going slowly. There is an element of reluctance in part of the sector, as James says, to engage more deeply with private sectors. Thankfully, there is part of us who are trying to break that mentality, but there is still an element of resistance. I do think that there's going to be progress, and I think looking at how particularly we make this shift towards cash and universal social protection flows more and more in a number of countries more feasible with the support of private sector. It's definitely a key area of change for the sector.
We're nearly out of time, but I wanted to come back to something that David mentioned near the top, that governments should be stepping up, but instead they're stepping back. And I think you meant both with aid provision, but also with diplomacy. And we've had a question on that. This is from Dr. Yasmin Nalawi here in the UK. I have a question about what David referred to as a crisis of diplomacy. Do or should aid organizations themselves hold a degree of responsibility for urging or forcing diplomacy in conflict countries? So is that a gap into which you and other organizations could move to try and do more to help with conflict prevention, or the diplomacy that's needed to get to the source of the problem, which you have to tackle, which is people refugees and others who are victims of conflict?
Well, it's a very interesting and good question, because we deal with the symptoms, not with the ultimate root causes. I mean, dealing with the ultimate root causes was historically been the business of diplomacy, but it's founded on the fact that the diplomacy that's needed now in this respect is for intrastate conflict, not interstate conflict. The tools of diplomacy were created to deal with conflict between states, not conflict within states. Now that creates a situation where there are NGOs that have moved into this space. They do what's called second or third track diplomacy. They talk to all kinds of armed actors who governments are risk averse about talking to. It's not actually our business. We focus on making the humanitarian aid system better in accord with the humanitarian principles of independence, neutrality, and humanity and impartiality. But actually, if you think about it, those principles are quite relevant to the search for unconventional diplomacy to try to address some of the most knotty problems. Now, I think there are limits to what can be done from the ground up. Ultimately, you do need to engage the geopolitical actors. I mean, if you think about the situation in northwest Syria, or even in northeast Syria, the global actors and the regional actors are absolutely key to that. But I think the answer to the question is that there is local level conflict resolution going on. I mean, if you think about perhaps the less politically obvious conflicts, if you think about some of the conflicts over land around the world, if you think about conflicts over justice, if you think about conflicts that involve ethnic and religious tension, some of those are more amenable to local engagement. And I think those are better suited to international or local NGO, what's called peacemaking, conflict resolution, rather than the peacekeeping, which ultimately is a geopolitical responsibility. So I guess the short answer is yes, there's room, but there's also limits if you haven't got big local, regional and global governments involved using the leverage that is only ultimately at their disposal.
James, do you have any thoughts on that? Because your organisation is also literally dealing with picking up the pieces, the mess left by conflict.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'll just say I completely agree with what David's just said. But just to give some detail, our biggest program is in Afghanistan. Depending on the time of year, we have about 3,500 people there. We've regularly employed ex-Taliban. You know, I'm an ex-commander in Helmand. I'm an ex-soldier, but I enjoy, I take pleasure in sitting down with ex-Taliban fighters as warriors together and drinking tea. And I feel that my organisation could be part of that kind of landing zone for a peace deal in Afghanistan if the thinking was there. And you know, I can give a man a job, an ex-fighter, take the AK-47 off him and give him a mine detector. And we can re-employ people on a large scale. And yet I don't see that kind of thinking happening, because again, I'm afraid it does come back to this siloing. You know, we just see different bits of the British state in the context of the UK acting in silos in Afghanistan. And it's not good enough. It could be so much better. And I feel that we have a lot more to offer. And I really do hope that we don't get involved in lots of rearranging the furniture. I think we should delay the big things, but we can, at a local level, at embassy level, really get DFID and the Foreign Office working together to achieve a far more integrated result in the next few months.
A final word from you, Narmeen, on this question. Do you think that there's a role here for NGOs if you look at your organisation? We've heard from James. David's talked about that. Is there something that you feel at a local level that you could be doing to fill in this gap?
Well, I think there are limitations to what small grassroots organizations can do. I agree with David that peacemaking at a local level is something that, you know, and internal conflicts, you know, for instance, ethnic tensions or religious tensions. Those are things that local organizations can address. But bigger issues, I think, are beyond the scope of smaller organizations. And they will probably endanger themselves if they were to delve in, because I've mentioned the issue about trust and about within countries, the sort of adversarial relationship between governments, national security institutions and NGOs. And that, that dynamic is sort of a delicate line to tread for smaller organizations. So I think it's a difficult question.
Well, we're at the end of our time on this panel. We've roamed over a great many subjects, and we've touched on the topic of the day, the rearranging of the furniture, as some have said, of the aid and foreign policy structure in the British government. There are a lot of questions still to be had, and my apologies to you if you've sent us a question we haven't managed to include it in this webinar. There will be many more. And let me remind you that tomorrow at the same time, the Geopolitics Centre is returning to a related theme of the role of NGOs and the responsibility of protect, when my colleague Dr. Thomas Peake will be your host with his guests, Karen Smith, Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General on the responsibility to protect, Wai Nu of the U Leadership Centre in Yangon, and Kerry Wigham, Assistant Professor of Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention at Binghamton University. But for now, many thanks to our panel, David Miliband, Dr. Narmeen Hamid, James Cowan, and Sara Pantuliano. And that's it from this geopolitics seminar from the University of Cambridge. Do join us again soon.